All right, so are you ready for this? We're tackling RMADA 3 today. You guys have had some serious questions about this CMS program.
Oh, yeah.
And, well, we do too.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it is. So, to get some answers, we're going straight to the source, the actual statement of work document.
The blueprint.
Yeah. This document lays out, like, the entire system. I'm not a healthcare expert, but I got to say, even I was fascinated by some of the things in here.
Well, and that's what's so interesting is that it's, you think statement of work and you're thinking, oh, this is just a bunch of bureaucratic jargon.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's really not. I mean, it really is a glimpse into how CMS sees the future of healthcare.
Right. So let's start with the very basics. What is this thing, RMADA 3?
Well, think of it this way.
Okay.
It's like you're trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle. Imagine the American healthcare system is this huge puzzle, and you need all the pieces, right, to see the full picture.
Right.
And that's what RMADA 3 is for. It's essentially a framework that helps CMS partner with all these different organizations to design, test, and study new ways to deliver healthcare.
Oh!
So it's like a giant laboratory for healthcare innovation.
Okay, so it's all about testing out these new ideas. But, and the document really stresses this, it's not an IT contract. So we're not talking about like building new software or anything.
You're exactly right.
Okay.
It's not about that. And the document stresses that distinction. The real focus is on using data.
Okay.
And, massive amounts of data to try to figure out how to improve healthcare, both in terms of quality, and this is key, and decost. So it's about using information strategically to actually get to real solutions.
Okay, this is where I started getting really interested. The document keeps mentioning something called model space.
Yeah.
Which honestly sounds like something out of Star Trek. What is that?
Well, it's not quite warp drive.
Right.
But IS, really cool.
Okay.
Imagine a virtual sandbox where these contractors can actually get in there and play with real healthcare data, testing out different scenarios, different approaches, but in this totally secure environment. It's like, a flight simulator for healthcare innovation.
Wow.
So that they can refine these ideas before actually launching them in the real world.
Oh, so they're not just throwing stuff against the wall and hoping something sticks. But okay, let's say they come up with this really promising new model and model space.
Right.
What happens next? The document talks about a pre-implementation phase.
Mm-hmm.
Does that just mean tons of paperwork and red tape?
Well, there's definitely planning involved and preparation. But you can think of it like they're laying the groundwork for success. They're getting the right people, the right resources, the right systems in place before they actually launch this thing.
That sounds like it would take forever, though.
Yeah.
Healthcare bureaucracy is legendary.
Yeah, you're not wrong. But the document actually emphasizes the need for speed and agility. Many of these models go from the drawing board to real-world testing in just 2 years.
Whoa, really?
Which is really fast for healthcare.
Yeah, that is a tight timeline. How do they even make sure that these models are going to work in the real world and not just on paper?
Well, that's where the model sites come in.
Okay.
So these are actual healthcare providers like hospitals or clinics who are chosen to pilot the new approach.
Oh, okay.
And CMS gives them tons of support, technical assistance, training, guidance on how to collect and analyze data. So it's like a hands-on learning experience.
Okay, so CMS is like the mentor, guiding them through it. But what about the people actually using these new models, the patients? How do they fit into all of this?
That's a crucial point, and I think the document really gets that. They emphasize clear communication, reducing anxiety for consumers, making sure that the materials are easy for everyday people to understand. They even suggest using things like infographics and, wait for it, podcasts.
Ooh, they said the magic word.
Right.
But it makes sense. If you're trying to change how healthcare works, you need everybody on board, not just the experts.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just here's how this model works. It's about understanding the unique needs and concerns of different patients. Yeah. Especially those who are already, maybe struggling to navigate the system.
Right. So meeting people where they are and building that trust makes sense. Now, the document also goes into the actual design and implementation of these new models.
Right.
Which sounds pretty complicated. Where do they even begin?
Well, they start by really emphasizing the importance of clear, operational procedures. Basically, the instruction manuals for how these things should work in practice.
Okay.
Think of it like a recipe. If you want to bake a cake, you need precise measurements, right?
Yeah.
You can't just wing it, especially with something as important as healthcare.
No, absolutely not. Okay, so they've got these detailed recipes for each model, but what about quality control? How do they make sure that these new approaches are actually improving healthcare?
That's where the quality strategy comes in. They're not just changing the system to change it. They want to make sure that these new models lead to better outcomes for patients.
Right, that makes sense. But healthcare is also a business, so who's handling the money side of all this innovation?
Well, they have a specific role for that. It's called the Innovation Payment Contractor, or IPC. They're kind of like the referees of the financial game,
Okay.
making sure that payments are collected correctly, that everyone's following the rules.
So they're like the money managers for the whole thing.
Yeah.
But what happens if someone has a question or a concern? Like, say, a doctor's confused about how the new model works, or a patient is worried about their coverage.
Well, they've got that covered too.
Okay.
The document talks about the need for a system to handle those beneficiary and provider inquiries.
Okay.
You know, they really want to be responsive, be transparent, make sure that everyone feels heard and supported throughout this whole process.
Okay, so we've got the planning, the design, the implementation, the financial side of things. But it sounds like they're really putting a lot of emphasis on that human element, too.
Yeah.
Making sure there's good communication and collaboration.
Absolutely. Because, I mean, ultimately, these new models are going to live or die based on the people involved, the healthcare providers, the patients, the policymakers. They all got to work together to make the system better.
Now, all this talk about models and phases has my head spinning a little.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Can we, break it down?
Mm-hmm.
The document mentions these 3 key phases. You've got pre-implementation, then design, implement, and evaluate, and then learning, improvement, and diffusion.
Yeah, that's a great way to organize it.
Okay.
Let's dive into each of those and see what they're all about. So we've already kind of touched on pre-implementation, but let's unpack a little more. Remember those data sharing agreements we talked about? This is where those become super important.
Okay, so they're gathering all this data to figure out, where are the problems and what kind of model might actually work best.
Exactly. And they're figuring out how that data is going to be collected, how it's managed, how it's used throughout the whole project. It's like building the infrastructure for a data-driven highway.
And this is also when they're providing all that technical assistance to the model sites.
Right.
Making sure that those folks are ready to go. Okay, so once they've laid all that groundwork in pre-implementation, what's next?
Then it's design, implement, and evaluate.
Okay.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
Okay.
All those detailed standard operating procedures.
Right.
That's the blueprint for how they actually put the model into action.
So taking the theory
Yeah.
and putting it into practice. But how do they know if it's actually working?
That's where the evaluate part comes in. They're constantly monitoring data, analyzing those outcomes, making adjustments as needed. It's a very dynamic process.
Okay, so they're learning as they go and making sure the model's actually making things better. But what happens when they've gathered all this data, learned a ton from the pilot? That's where the 3rd phase kicks in, right? Learning, improvement, and diffusion.
That's it. This phase is all about making sure that the lessons learned from these projects don't just stay stuck inside the project. They want to spread these insights and best practices to the whole healthcare system.
Oh, okay. So it's like they're paying it forward.
Right.
Sharing what they've learned so that others can benefit.
And they do it in a really smart way. They create these things called learning communities. So people involved in different models can all come together, share their experiences, the successes, the challenges. Imagine doctors and nurses and administrators from all over the country connecting and brainstorming and inspiring each other to do better.
Wow. Like a giant think tank for healthcare. I love that.
Yeah.
But what about the models that are, really successful? How do they take those and make sure more people can benefit?
Well, that's where the scale and closeout phase comes in.
Okay.
And they actually lay out specific procedures for how to transition those successful models into the wider healthcare system.
And what about the models that, maybe didn't work out so well? Do they just kind of sweep those under the rug?
Oh, not at all.
Okay.
They're just as meticulous about documenting the data from those projects because even those, quote, failures can teach us something valuable.
Right. So they're learning from everything.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they're committed to being transparent through the whole process. Reporting to Congress when they need to, archiving all the data and documentation so that people can analyze it in the future.
So they're not just trying to innovate. They're building this, knowledge base for the future of healthcare.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And all of it is guided by this core principle. Use data to make decisions and use data to make healthcare better for everyone.
Wow. This RMADA 3 program is way more complex and interesting than I ever realized. Like, it's a whole ecosystem of innovation.
It really is.
It's amazing.
And it's constantly evolving and adapting, just like the healthcare system itself.
All right, so now that we kind of have a handle on the big picture, let's zoom in on some of the details. What stood out to you as particularly interesting or surprising in this document?
Well, one thing that really struck me was the focus on design thinking.
Oh, okay.
Not just in the models themselves,
Okay.
but in how they actually talk about them. They're really pushing for using design principles to make this complex information easier to understand.
Oh, interesting. So we're not just talking about, like, these dry technical documents.
No.
Okay.
They're talking about, like, infographics, timelines, even interactive tools.
Oh, wow.
So that people can really visualize how these models work.
I like that.
They even specifically say podcasts.
Well, they got us there. But it makes sense, right? If you want people to be on board with these new approaches to healthcare,
right,
you got to explain it in a way that, like, normal people can understand.
Exactly. And they're not just thinking about, doctors and nurses.
Yeah.
They're talking about making materials that are consumer friendly too. Imagine you're trying to navigate this new healthcare model, but you're already stressed out about your health.
Oh, yeah.
Having clear, concise, easy to understand information, that can make a huge difference.
That's true. It's like they're trying to take the mystery out of healthcare.
Right.
Which I like. I like that a lot. Okay, another thing that jumped out at me was how they talked about the unique characteristics of these new models.
Mm-hmm.
How are they different from what CMS has done in the past?
Well, for one thing, these are much bigger and more complex than, the old CMS demonstration projects.
Okay.
They often involve multiple payers,
Okay.
like Medicare, private insurers, all working together. So that just adds a whole other level of complexity.
It's not just like tweaking things around the edges.
No.
They're trying to completely change how things work.
Yeah.
But logistically, that must be a nightmare.
Yeah.
To get all these different players on the same page.
Right. And remember that tight 2-year timeline we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
That just adds to the pressure. They highlight the need for really close coordination, flexibility, being able to adapt to change quickly.
So they're basically building a plane while it's in the air.
Yeah, pretty much.
But it also means that they're not afraid to experiment,
right,
to try new things.
Exactly.
I like that. Now, we've talked a lot about data,
yeah,
like how that's the fuel for this whole innovation engine.
Yeah.
But the document actually gets really specific about the types of data they need. What are they looking for?
It's not just about collecting any data. They're very strategic. They want to make sure that they're using the right data sources for each model. So they're using Medicare claims data, Medicaid data, even information from private insurers.
Wow, the whole gamut.
Yeah. And then on top of that, they emphasize primary data collection, things like surveys and interviews to get insights from the people who are actually using these models.
So it's like a mix of different data sources to get that full picture.
Exactly. And they stress having a clear data acquisition strategy.
Okay.
And, thinking about things like timeliness, the cost, how easy it is to access the data. It's all about being smart about how you use this valuable resource.
Okay. Now, one thing that kept coming up was the idea of engagement.
Mm-hmm.
What do they actually mean by that?
Well, when they say engagement, they're really talking about collaboration and communication.
Okay.
Both within the team working on the project and with all the stakeholders outside the project.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just designing these models in a vacuum. They're going out and talking to the people who will be affected. Doctors, nurses, patients, policymakers, everybody gets a voice.
Oh, okay.
To make sure that these models are not only effective, but also accepted and embraced by the people who will be using them.
Right. So it's about building consensus.
Yeah.
And making sure that everyone feels like they're a part of the process.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just getting feedback. It's about building relationships and trust.
Now, let's talk about something that we touched on earlier, which is health equity.
Yes.
This comes up a lot in the document.
Yeah.
It's clearly a big priority for CMS.
It's not just talk either.
Oh.
They actually reference the CMS framework for health equity, which is a whole other document that outlines specific steps for addressing health disparities. They want to make sure that these improvements benefit everyone, regardless of, their background or their circumstances.
Important.
It is. So they're not just creating new models, they're creating a system that's more just.
I like that.
Okay.
Okay, so now that we've kind of laid the groundwork, let's dive back into those 3 key phases of a typical RMA3 project.
Okay.
We've already talked about pre-implementation. Let's move on to design, implement, and evaluate. What are some of the things that are happening in that phase?
Well, this is where all that planning and preparation in the earlier phase really pays off.
Okay.
This is where those standard operating procedures that we talked about, they become the blueprints for how the model is actually put into action.
So they're taking the recipe and actually baking the cake now.
Right. But it's not just about following the instructions blindly.
Right.
They also emphasize developing a comprehensive quality strategy for each model to make sure that these new approaches are actually improving things for the patients.
So they're monitoring everything, making sure it's all working as it's supposed to.
Exactly. They're using data to drive continuous improvement, making adjustments as needed along the way.
That makes sense. But healthcare is also a business, so who's keeping track of all the money?
Well, that's the Innovation Payment Contractor's job,
the
IPC.
Right.
They're responsible for the financial side of things, making sure that all the payments are done right, that everyone's following the rules.
So they're like the financial watchdogs.
Yeah.
But what about the people who are actually using and participating in these models? The patients, the doctors, do they have any say?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good.
They really stress the importance of beneficiary and provider inquiries, making sure there are ways for people to get their questions answered, to voice any concerns they have.
Right, so it's not just like, we're doing this to you.
All right.
It's, we're doing this with you.
Exactly.
I like that.
It's about collaboration.
Okay, so we've got the design, the implementation, the evaluation, the financial side, the engagement with everybody. It's a lot to juggle.
It is, but it seems like they've thought of everything.
Yeah.
And they're committed to making this whole process transparent and accountable.
All right, let's move on to the third and final phase, learning, improvement, and diffusion. This is where things get exciting. What happens after they've run the pilot and they've got all this data?
Well, this is all about taking the lessons learned, and I mean both the good and the bad, and sharing it with the rest of the healthcare community. The goal is to make sure that these innovations don't just stay within this little project, but that they have the potential to change healthcare on a bigger scale.
So it's about taking those successes and making sure that they actually make a difference in people's lives.
Exactly. And they have a really smart way of doing this. They're creating these things called learning communities where people from different models can come together and share what worked for them, brainstorm, get inspired to do even better.
It's like this giant brain trust for healthcare.
Right. And they're putting a lot of emphasis on using data to figure out what works. It's not just about sharing stories. It's about really digging into the data to understand what's working, what's not, and how to improve.
So celebrating the successes, but also like understanding the why behind them so you can repeat them.
Right.
Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into RMADA 3, there's one more thing we need to talk about. What happens when a model comes to an end? You mean when the pilot's over?
Yeah.
Does everything just stop?
Not quite. The document actually outlines procedures for both scaling up the successful models and gracefully closing out the ones that have, run their course.
So whether it's a victory lap or a lesson learned, they've got a plan in place.
Exactly. And they don't just abandon all the data that they collected. They talk about creating transition documents, archiving the data, and even creating reports for Congress.
And it's all about accountability and transparency, even if a model doesn't ultimately work. The lessons learned are still valuable.
Exactly. They're very meticulous about data privacy, too.
Oh, okay.
Outlining steps for how to close out those data use agreements and make sure that sensitive information is protected.
It's like responsible data stewardship from beginning to end.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay, good. One thing that really struck me as we were going through all of this was just how complex these RMADA 3 projects are.
Yeah, they're massive.
They're huge. Like the level of detail, the amount of planning that goes into every aspect.
It's impressive.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah. They're not just winging it. They've got a whole system for driving innovation.
Right. And they're also not afraid to, adapt it and revise as they learn from each project.
Okay. And they're very clear that it takes a lot of different people to make this happen. Like you need economists, data analysts, quality improvement people, communication experts.
It takes a village.
It really does. Yeah, it really shows you that healthcare innovation, it's a team effort. It's not just about, one brilliant doctor coming up with a cure for something.
Right.
It's about the whole system.
Right.
Making sure that those breakthroughs can actually get to the people who need them.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the scale and closeout phase, which is all about making sure that those successes have a lasting impact. What's really interesting is that they don't just hand things over and walk away. They actually talk about providing ongoing support, developing training materials.
Oh, wow.
Even doing these actuarial analyses to figure out what the financial implications are of actually scaling up a model.
So they're really invested in seeing these models succeed.
Yeah, it's not just, here's an idea, good luck.
Right, exactly.
They're in it for the long haul.
And even if a model's not successful,
Right.
or if it's just run its course,
Yeah.
they still have this plan for wrapping things up.
Right. Responsibly.
Responsibly. What do you mean by that?
Well, they're really clear about the need for documentation, archiving data, making sure those data use agreements are closed out properly to protect people's privacy.
Okay, so they're not just abandoning ship.
Yeah.
They're tying up all the loose ends, making sure that the lessons, even from models that maybe weren't successful, are still preserved.
Yeah, and they're really big on transparency.
Okay.
They even talk about reporting to Congress when they're required to, giving them summaries of how the model performed, making sure that all that data and documentation are archived so people can look back on it.
So it's like creating this historical record of healthcare innovation, a roadmap for the future.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about fixing the problems of today, but laying the groundwork for a better healthcare system tomorrow.
You know, after going through this RMADA 3 document, I'm just amazed by how much more it is than just a program. It's a whole system. It's constantly learning and growing.
It really is. It's like a laboratory for healthcare innovation,
Yeah.
but one with a heart. They've really thought of everything from the tiny details of data management to the big picture stuff like communication and making sure everyone's on board.
And that focus on health equity, that's so important.
It is.
It's not just about making the system more efficient, it's about making it fairer for everyone.
And that's what makes this document so fascinating. It's not just a boring technical manual.
Right.
It gives us this glimpse into what healthcare could be like in the future. More innovative, more collaborative, more equitable.
I have to say, you've given me a whole new perspective on RMADA 3.
Glad to hear it.
It's definitely complicated.
Yeah.
But it's exciting to see how much effort is going into, like, making healthcare better.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great diving into this with you. Hopefully, our listeners have a better understanding of how RMADA 3 is working to shape the future of healthcare.
And if you want to learn even more, we've got links to some additional resources in the show notes. Happy learning.